the second presentation from Emory Carter Center Speakers Series on U.S.-China relations. Early this year, we had the good fortune of inviting one of China's most eminent diplomats, Ambassador Wu Jianmin, to campus. We had a full house at the Center for Ethics. And unfortunately, that was one of the last public presentations he ever gave. In June, on his way to Wuhan University to deliver a presentation, there was a car crash and he died over there. So that's David is our second speaker here. We'll keep this speaker going here at Emory. Now the EastWest Institute, you also have an introduction in the program. When I was there early in the summer, I was told EastWest Institute actually has two missions. One is to pierce the iron curtain. I think that you did it. The second mission now is to pierce the bamboo curtain. David is on his way to finish that. So yesterday I was talking to a common acquaintance who said, the best way to introduce David is to have him here and deliver his lecture in Chinese. So without further ado, David will deliver his lecture in Chinese. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. You put me on the spot, and maybe we'll get to the Chinese a little bit later. But I'm really delighted and honored to be here. And it's a real privilege for me to have the opportunity to be here at Emory University, a terrific university that I have not yet had the privilege of visiting. Also to be here under the auspices of the Carter Center, and I'm really grateful to Dr. Liu for his and his team's hospitality, and thankful to the Hala Institute as well as the Confucius Institute for the opportunity and the privilege of being with all of you today. I've been to Atlanta a number of times over the years, including about 2 years ago. We as an institute, the EastWest Institute, which is a New York City-based foreign policy and conflict reduction think tank that specializes in Track 2 diplomacy, which I can talk about later. We have some real ties to Atlanta. Two of those ties are a couple of our very significant members of our board of directors, Bill Ide, chairman of our executive committee, and Joel Cowan, who has been a tremendous supporter of the EastWest Institute's China work and who's with us today, is another real treasure of the EastWest Institute with respect to our China work. So Atlanta is very near and dear to the heart of the EastWest Institute, and it's great to be back here with all of you. We have about an hour and a half, and we have a very rich topic, so without further ado, I want to segue into the topic at hand. And let me just see if I can switch microphones. Can you all hear me okay using this microphone, or does my voice project sufficiently to the back of the auditorium? Okay. Okay. Well, let me try to utilize this mic so that I can have my hands free here. And just to say that the topic at hand today is the South China Sea, and specifically 3 different facets of the issue that I think are relatively understudied. And I'm very cognizant that the issue of the South China Sea has been very topical, very timely, very much in the news. There's scarcely a day or a week that you can go without hearing something about the South China Sea in the media. And yet there are facets of the problem that I think have yet to be fully explored, and that's what I want to focus on in my comments today. So let me map out for you what I'd like to do over the course of perhaps the next 45 or 60 minutes. And then, needless to say, I'd like to leave a good amount of time toward the end of our time together for any questions and any discussion that you'd like to have on this topic. It's a very rich topic, and what I'm hoping to do today is to lay out an original take on the issue that is a little different from a lot of the things that we've seen in media reports and in think tank analyses and in the policymaking world. And I intend for my comments to be unconventional and perhaps even a little bit controversial, and hopefully a little provocative in the intellectual sense of the term, to stimulate your reaction, your comments, your feedback. And for me, that feedback is very important, because the work that I'm doing and that the EastWest Institute is doing on the issue of the South China Sea today is intended to be not so much academic or theoretical work per se, but to actually be very real world and pragmatic, and with an eye toward hopefully making a difference on an issue that has come to be seen as intractable, difficult, and destabilizing in a very important region of the world. So your feedback to these ideas matters a lot to me. This is the first time that I'm giving this particular talk anywhere, and as proof of that, I could show you the notes that I wrote on a very comfortable Delta flight from Washington this morning, crystallizing some of the thinking that I've been doing. But I very much do hope to get your feedback, including disagreement, as you see fit, with the ideas that I put forward. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, first of all, kind of a general overview of the topic with some background and context for the issues that I'd like to address. Number two, to talk about the current framing of the South China Sea issue, because I think that's an important part of contextualizing the comments that I'm going to make. And then thirdly, to go into three particular areas of the South China Sea issue that I think thus far are understudied and underexplored. And those three areas, which collectively constitute kind of the heart and soul of my presentation, are, number one, to look at the actual doctrines and policies of the United States and China specifically, where it comes to the issue of the South China Sea, and specifically to map out where the disagreements between the United States and China are and where they're not. Because one of the things that I'll talk about in some detail in my presentation is that I think in the current framing of the issue and the current understanding of the issue as an issue in U.S.-China relations, sometimes the differences between the United States and China are actually overstated to a considerable degree. And I'll give examples of that in a little while. That may sound unconventional or counter-conventional because all that we read in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the papers and on the internet and television coverage of the subject tends to frame it as we're on opposite ends of the world when it comes to the South China Sea. But what I'll show is that that is probably an overstatement of the differences that are real between the United States and China. So I want to map the doctrines, the policies, and with an eye toward laying out where the policy differences really are and where they are not. The second thing that I want to do in this section of my comments is to look into the question of the strategic assumptions that are made by both the United States and China. That may sound kind of basic, but I have found that this is an often overlooked element of the issue of the South China Sea as an issue in U.S.-China relations. So this question goes to the sort of assumptions that underpin or undergird U.S. thinking, Chinese thinking, U.S. and Chinese policies, and U.S. and Chinese actions on the South China Sea. We know what the policies are, we know what the declarations from foreign ministry spokesmen's lecterns are, but what are some of the strategic assumptions that undergird those actions? That's something that I think has been relatively overlooked in the substantial treatment that this issue has gotten over the years, and I want to delve a little bit into that. And as I think you'll see, that becomes a very interesting and enlightening area to look at when we look at the South China Sea. And the third part of this talk is going to be looking at the diverging strategic perceptions of the United States and China when it comes to the South China Sea. So one of the phenomena that we see between the United States and China on this issue is that the fact is we often, the two countries, the United States and China, look at the same set of facts, but come away with very, very different interpretations or assessments of those facts. So the facts are there, they're sometimes, often agreed on, and yet the interpretations of those facts can lead the two countries to diametrically opposed positions. that's a phenomenon that I think is also worth exploring. So in short, I want to look at the policies, the assumptions, and the perceptions in this issue of the South China Sea. Now let me also note that right at the outset, I'm very cognizant that in some sense the South China Sea issue itself is not a U.S.-China relations issue per se. It is an issue that involves 6 claimants. It involves international law, it involves different jurisdictions, it involves China, it involves Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia. And the United States is not a claimant to any of the land or the water in the South China Sea. But I keep stressing the U.S.-China angle because in any case, the issue has come to be framed in the United States, as I'll talk about in a minute, and to a substantial degree in China as a U.S.-China issue. And so, because that is so, for better or worse, the fact is the issue is having an impact on the bilateral relationship, that between the United States and China, just as it is having differing impacts on China's bilateral relations with other claimants and other stakeholders. But rather than focus on the issue as a whole, involving a multilateral group of nations and claimants, I'm going to look specifically at the U.S.-China element. And I very much would offer my remarks today in the spirit, and if I can use the old Chinese chengyu, of pao zhuan yin yu, which is to say to throw out a brick for the purpose of retrieving jade in the form of your, as we say, precious criticism and comments after my comments, because this is very much a work in progress. And this is something that we hope, again, to be operational rather than academic. So with that, let me just say a few words about the issue of the South China Sea by way of overview and background and context. Now, just in very brief terms, I think everyone is generally familiar with the issue. I won't go into great detail, but I think it's important to at least note a few things by way of providing a backdrop for the rest of the discussion. So, the South China Sea is a very important body of water, basically bounded in the north by China, in the south by Brunei and Malaysia, in the west by Vietnam, and the east by the Philippines. And through this body of water, about 1/3 of all global trade flows in one direction or another. About $5 trillion of trade per year. The South China Sea is also a body of water that is home to an extraordinary abundance of fishing resources, i.e. fish, of fisheries, of energy, estimated oil that is yet untapped beneath the bed of the sea in the South China Sea comes to about 28 billion barrels. That's the estimate that's out there. Proven, I think there are proven reserves of oil of about 1/4 that amount. The estimates go predicted or estimated that there are much more substantial amounts of oil that are there to be tapped. In terms of natural gas, there are about 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas underneath the surface of that ocean, underneath the bed of the ocean, rather. And so from an economic and resource standpoint, this is an incredibly important body of water, and it is disproportionately the conduit for a substantial plurality of global trade in the world. A lot of it either coming from or going to China, coming from or going to Japan, the world's second and third largest economies. A lot of it coming from or going to the United States ultimately, obviously the world's biggest economy. And so you can see that the critical players of the world from an economic standpoint have their economies and their prosperity bound up inextricably with the ability of goods and services, goods in particular, to flow across the waters of the South China Sea. I mentioned that there are 6 claimants. China, that is the Chinese mainland, that is the People's Republic of China, but also Taiwan in its capacity as the Republic of China. It's interesting to note at the outset that the mainland's and Taiwan's claims in the South China Sea are identical, essentially, but they make them in the names of 2 distinct regimes. The People's Republic of China in the case of the mainland, and in the name of the Republic of China in the case of Taiwan. but the claim itself is coterminous, and essentially it's two entities, if you will, juridically claiming the same body of water. In addition, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei are the other major claimants. So, as I noted earlier, the United States itself is not a claimant to any of the land or the water in the South China Sea. But the United States is very deeply involved in the issue for a number of reasons, but not least as a matter of U.S. doctrine and as a matter of U.S. policy, which we'll talk more about, because the United States takes a national interest, and a serious national interest, in the issue of the freedom of navigation on the surface of those waters. Because to such a great degree, the U.S. economy and so many other economies depend on goods being able to pass those water in a way that is secure and that no one has to worry about conflict or destabilization. So those are some of the basic points that I would make. Perhaps the only other one to note before talking a little bit about the South China Sea's topicality is that I think everyone in here is probably familiar with the phrase the 9-dash line, which is a claim that China makes in essentially the same form, a claim that Taiwan, as the Republic of China, makes with respect to a claim of sovereignty over certain land and water features within what is called a 9-dash line that basically encircles about 90% of the entirety of the South China Sea. You'll hear me come back to that construct later because the concept of the 9-dash line, which is, for purposes of this discussion, some type of claim leveled by the Chinese about the sea, and I'll go into details as to what it means and what it doesn't mean, that is very much at the center of any discussion of the South China Sea, and it's certainly been at the center of the framing of the issue in terms of the United States. Just as a side note, since we are in a presidential election year, it's worth noting that one of the things, just as a bit of a sidebar, one of the things that I have researched during my time at the EastWest Institute is the nexus between U.S. domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy, the nexus also between presidential campaign communication and foreign policy, and most specifically, the nexus between presidential campaign communication and China. And I've done quite a bit of research in these areas. And one of the things I found, just as an interesting data point, a bit of a digression, but an interesting data point that's salient to the topic, is that the words South China Sea were never mentioned in a presidential debate until last year in American history. So the first mention of the term South China Sea, as far as I can tell in research of having looked at debate transcripts, etc., was in actually specifically the Republican primary debates of last year. And the reason I mention that is it goes to the issue which I'll segue into shortly, of the U.S. framing of the South China Sea issue. Because the kind of comments that people like Marco Rubio and Governor Kasich and Jeb Bush, to a lesser degree on this particular issue, Donald Trump, and others were making, were basically that, in their words, not mine, China is, quote, taking over the South China Sea. That's an exact phrase that was used in the GOP debates last year, prior to the conclusion of the Republican primary process. By the same token, Hillary Clinton, one of the two major Democratic candidates from last year into this year, referenced the South China Sea as well. And what's notable, again, is two things. That the South China Sea had never come up before in a presidential debate, and now it is coming up. That says something that's worth noting. The second point is the one that I've made, which is that framing has been rather dramatic, and that the basic understanding in the United States, or at least among presidential candidates, in their own words, is that China is taking over the South China Sea and we have to stop it. I'm not saying that's the correct interpretation, but what I am saying is that's the backdrop that we're dealing with. And with that, let me segue into a few words just about how the issue is framed in the United States. And there are other issues that one could delve into, but I'm going to come to them as we go along. One issue to keep in mind is the July 12th decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which I'll come back to, as we talk about mapping out U.S. and Chinese policy differences, diverging assumptions, and diverging perceptions. But in terms of the framing, let me say a few words to kind of set, again, the backdrop for a discussion of what I call the under-the-hood issues in U.S.-China relations on the issue of South China Sea. So, both in the United States and in China, despite the fact that the United States is not a claimant to any of the land or water in the South China Sea, we don't lay any claims to anything there. The U.S. does identify as a stakeholder. And notwithstanding the fact that the United States doesn't have a direct stake in the actual claims, but rather in freedom of navigation routes, the fact is this issue has come to color U.S.-China relations to a very substantial degree. And it's come to be characterized in the United States as it's us against them. They, this is from a U.S. perspective, and I'll come to the Chinese perspective in a second. They, China, are, quote, taking over the South China Sea. They, China, quote, claim the entire South China Sea. These are the kind of phrases that you see even in major media reporting, but also in presidential candidate discourse and framing. And thus it's kind of become portrayed as a test of wills between the United States and China. It's become seen as a kind of military competition between the United States and China. It's come to be seen, in a sense, as a military issue, even though, in fact, no shots have been fired and there is not an active state of conflict or warfare, or armed conflict, let's say, or warfare in this area. But nevertheless, rhetorically speaking, and in terms of the narrative, the issue has become militarized by journalists, by policymakers, and by others who are commenting on and observing events in the South China Sea. So there's very much an adversarial quality to how the issue is framed. It's also often lost in translation, if you will, or in this narrative, that in fact the United States is not a claimant to any of the land or water in the sea, as I've mentioned a few times. I mention it and I reiterate it because to read the reporting and the analysis and even statements from policymakers and in some cases defense officials and others, the framing seems to be that there is a kind of zero-sum game quality to the tensions between the United States and China. And that if they win something, by definition, we lose something. If they lose something, we win. And that we can't both win at the same time. So that's important to keep in mind. And that's one of the things that prompted me and our China Affairs team at the EastWest Institute to want to probe this issue more deeply. Now, from the Chinese perspective, notwithstanding the fact that the political system and the media system in China are very, very different, obviously, from those in the United States, the fact is we also see in China a fairly significant U.S.-China, a fairly significant effort to frame the issue as a U.S.-China issue. In many respects, China seems to take the point of view, and it's expressed by both officials and also in party-run media, which is to say in the Chinese media per se, that actors like the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, and others are in a sense of only derivative importance, that they are not the problem, they are the symptoms of the problem, the underlying problem, the underlying cause of instability, the underlying cause of militarization of the South China Sea, and so on, is the United States. There's a lot of that tonality in both official, quasi-official, and quote-unquote media commentary about these issues in the Chinese press. And so, both in the United States and in China, in different ways, with different accents, and because our systems are different, nevertheless we get to the same point, which is an adversarial framing that posits that the other side is the bad guy. And that's the kind of framing that we see in terms of the South China Sea issue. I think it is important to note that it is not an easy to solve. The South China Sea issue is not an easy issue to solve in any case. It becomes harder when the dominant narratives in both countries present the issue in adversarial zero-sum terms. And that, in my judgment, is one of the reasons that the issue has become as intractable as it seems to be, notwithstanding the fact that in a number of important regards, U.S. and Chinese policy and doctrine are actually, to a surprising degree, in conformity around certain key issues in the South China Sea. And I'll go into that in a second. But the framing of the issue as adversarial is something that I think is a contributor to the evident intractability of the issue, and thus it's important to deal with. Now, with that backdrop, let me just segue to the main points that I want to make, which are, again, threefold. I want to talk about the U.S. and Chinese doctrines and policies with respect to the South China Sea. And then I want to talk about the underlying assumptions, and then I want to talk about the perceptions. So, again, encapsulating my earlier comments, my judgment is that the mainstream framing of the issue is flawed, and it actually overstates the degree to which the United States and China are in disagreement on the issue of the South China Sea. This interpretation of mine kind of bucks the trend. It is somewhat counter-conventional relative to the established narratives that are out there. So I recognize that at the outset, that some people may hear this and say, gee, my understanding was that we're absolutely, 180 degrees apart, and this is intended to be a provocative, different take on the issue. Let me start by talking a little bit about the doctrines and the policies of the United States and China to sort of lay out more fully both where the areas of agreement or confluence are, at least as a matter of declared policies, and I'll come back to the notion of declared policies in a second, and then talk about where the areas of actual disagreement between the United States and China really are, and then make a brief sort of summary of that finding and then take that into our discussion of assumptions and perceptions. So I want to start by prefacing what I'm going to say by noting that you'll often hear me use the term declared doctrine or declared policy. And the reason I reference the notion of declared is because of something that I'll touch on a little bit later in my presentation. And that is that I think there is a question in the minds of some, both in the United States and in China, as to whether the declared doctrine and policy of each country represents the actual strategic thinking of each country. So I grant in my own analysis and in my own speaking about the topic that when you look at declared policy, you're looking at an empirical data set, because we can look at the statements that are made from the Foreign Ministry of China, from the State Department of the United States, from the presidents, and so on. And that is a matter of record. It's a matter of words on paper. It's public information. And it's empirical. Those words appear on a piece of paper. Whether those words capture the entirety or the fullness of the national position in question is a question mark that I'll come back to. So when I talk about declared, that's why I stress declared policy, declared doctrine, because I recognize there could be some divergence between declared policy and actual strategic thinking. Now, with that said, let me lay out what I see as a few areas of significant agreement or confluence between the United States and China where it comes to the issue of the South China Sea. First of all, at a very broad or doctrinal level, China has stated that it accepts the premise that the United States is an Asian-Pacific power. And President Xi Jinping himself has stated that. Chinese foreign policy doctrine grants that the United States is an Asia-Pacific power, that the United States is, in fact, the dominant Asian-Pacific power, and that the United States has been and can continue to be a force for stability, for security, in a way that benefits the various players of East Asia. China is actually on the record embracing all of that. Likewise, the United States is on the record in the form of presidential statements dating back several presidents, and certainly the current president and his predecessor, saying that the United States welcomes the rise of a strong and prosperous China that plays an increasingly important role in the world, that plays an increasingly important role in international relations, in East Asia, and so on. So at a doctrinal level, there is no fundamental incompatibility between the declared, here's the word again, the declared doctrines of China and the United States. We welcome each other's involvement in this region, the region that contains the South China Sea. Now, to put that in perspective just briefly, but in a sense to make the point that it's not merely an academic point, you could look back to the United States-Soviet example and not find that same level of doctrinal agreement or confluence. In the U.S.-Soviet case, and I'm saying that this is different from the U.S.-China case, in the U.S.-Soviet case, there was a sense that the world isn't big enough for the both of us. It's either our system that will triumph or your system that will triumph. And the very essence and definition of the Cold War was that it was a fundamental competition between systems. And that, in a sense, it was, by definition, a zero-sum game, ultimately. That is not the framing, as a matter of declared doctrine, of either the United States or China. And that in itself is an often overlooked commonality or confluence in our doctrines. The second point is that the South China Sea, and again, these are areas of agreement or confluence, the South China Sea specifically is enormously important both to the economies of China and the United States. All of us understand that, all of us agree about that, and to put it a different way, both the United States and China are major stakeholders in the South China Sea in the sense of the South China Sea's critical importance as a corridor of trade and investment. So in that regard, there's really no daylight, there's no difference between the U.S. and China's positions. Third, both the United States and China, and I would say, let's just, to be fair, both countries as a matter of declared policy have stated on the record that they believe in freedom of navigation, that they're for freedom of navigation, and that neither side seeks to impede freedom of navigation. And that's a really, really important doctrinal or policy level confluence between the two countries. Because if there were a disagreement about that, then whatever we've read up to now about the South China Sea, we would have read a lot worse, a lot more dramatic news coverage if we weren't in agreement on that very core principle. But at least at a level of declared doctrine and policy, we are in agreement. So there's another really important confluence that is not often discussed by policymakers or media representatives, journalists, and others who are writing. Now let me make a fourth point, and this one will seem perhaps a little bit provocative or not or somewhat counterintuitive, but I would argue that there is no inherent contradiction between the interests of the United States and China with respect to the great majority of issues regarding the South China Sea. Now, what I just said, that there's no inherent incompatibility of interest between the U.S. and China on the South China Sea, is pretty much the diametrical opposite of the media narrative and the policy narrative that exists in both countries. But the one point I would make to support that assertion here, and for the sake of relative brevity, but it's a persuasive point. It's a twofold fact. Number one, to repeat something I stated earlier, which bears repeating, the United States is not a claimant to any of the land or water in the South China Sea. So think about that. We don't have a claim that is in contradiction to any Chinese land or maritime claim in the South China Sea. That's a factual statement. That statement is a factual statement. It's not that they have this claim, we have that claim, and the two cannot coexist. We have no claims. That fact alone is very significant but you'll almost never see that fact referenced in a lot of the discussion of the issue. But it's really material when you're trying to understand where the conflict is and, as importantly, where the conflict isn't. But the second and related point I would make is that going one step further, the United States has said, as a matter of declared doctrine on this issue, that we don't take a position as to the merits of the territorial and maritime claims of others. So what the United States has said officially on the record, and its long-established U.S. policy, is it doesn't matter to us, these are my words, but I'm extrapolating and explaining the established policy. It doesn't matter to us ultimately who gets this island or this reef or this atoll or this low tide elevation. As long as it's worked out peacefully, we don't care who gets what. It doesn't matter to us. That's the official U.S. position on the issue. So to take it one step further and make an intellectual point, and I'll go into the realm of a far-fetched hypothetical, and I recognize that at the outset, to make an intellectual point. If by some miracle China were to negotiate with the other 5 claimants, including Taiwan, but also Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, and somehow, in an alternative universe that doesn't exist, China were able to convince all the others to give every single island and every single reef of the 250 land features that are in, it's about 250 land features that are in the South China Sea, to give all of them to China. If China were able to persuade the other 5 claimants to do that, as a matter of declared U.S. policy, that would be okay with the United States. So the notion that, now let me reiterate one point. As a matter of declared policy, that would be okay with the United States. I think there is a legitimate question, which we can touch on later as we talk about assumptions, as to whether that is an accurate assessment of U.S. strategic thinking. But it is, in fact, an accurate characterization of U.S. policy. That I can say. So when you think of it in those terms, now the scenario that I described is not going to happen. But to make that intellectual point, that's where U.S. policy is. It is not in conflict with essentially the entirety of China's claims to land in the South China Sea. Where the U.S. places its emphasis is that, in our judgment, freedom of navigation is sacred and has to be protected. And number 2, whatever solutions and resolution of the issue ultimately materialize have to come out of a peaceful process that is in accordance with established international law. As long as those process requirements are met, the U.S. doesn't take a position on the actual substance. So when you think of it in those terms, it's not unfair to say that there is not an inherent conflict between China's position and the U.S. position. So what I've tried to do is take a statement that may seem very strange and play it out intellectually to make it seem less strange at second or third glance. Let me make a couple of other points before shifting to the areas of disagreement and then moving on to the assumptions and perceptions. Another area of disagreement is that neither side, neither the United States nor China, has resorted to the application of lethal military force in the South China Sea. And neither side wants to. In fact, I would go further and say neither side believes that its interests would be served in applying lethal military force in the sea. Has there been coercion? Yes. Has there been an increase in tensions and, in some cases, ships that bump into each other, planes that come very close to each other, and so on? Yes. Has there been a shooting war or a serious application of armed force in the South China Sea? No, there hasn't. Neither China nor the United States wants to see events go in that direction. So that's a commonality. At the same time, both sides claim to want to see peaceful resolution of the issue. in my discussion of assumptions, I'll pose an interesting question that relates to the issue of what each side sees as the optimal state of affairs, but I'll come back to that. But at least as a matter of process, both sides claim to want to see peaceful resolution of the issues. Both sides attach substantial importance to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. One of the interesting ironies, as a bit of a side note, in the South China Sea issue is that China is a ratified signatory to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, UNCLOS. China is a ratified signatory to UNCLOS, but does not accept all its terms. The United States is not a ratified signatory to UNCLOS, but does accept its terms. And that's one of the interesting ironies within this particular situation. But that being said, as a general matter, both sides attach pretty substantial weight to UNCLOS. There are real differences as to some of the details of how that's applied. But fundamentally, China, as a ratified signatory to UNCLOS, embraces UNCLOS. And the U.S., even though it is not a ratified signatory to UNCLOS, notwithstanding the exhortations of several presidents of both parties, because it requires Senate approval and ratification, and that's never been doable politically in the United States, we nevertheless, as a matter of policy, adhere to UNCLOS's stipulations. So UNCLOS is, to a substantial, not complete, but substantial degree, a source of some confluence in our policies. All of those areas that I just mentioned are actually areas where there is substantial common ground between the United States and China on the South China Sea issue, but they're often not referenced either by policymakers or by those writing about the issue. Now that said, there are areas of disagreement. There actually are areas of disagreement between the United States and China on the matter of the South China Sea. But my thesis is that they're much narrower than is commonly understood or appreciated. So let me lay out where I think the actual areas of disagreement are. Partly to say, okay, yes, here are the disagreements, but partly to also illustrate that the disagreements are much smaller in scale or scope than is generally perceived to be the case. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the 9-dash line, which I referenced earlier. China makes a claim to sovereignty in the South China Sea, in parts of the South China Sea that is referred to as the 9-dash line claim. We don't have a map of it up, but if you were to imagine the South China Sea in the middle of that screen, there's a big U-shaped 9-dash line that goes basically down the coast of Vietnam, just off the northern coast of Brunei and Malaysia, up the western coast of the Philippines, and pretty close to the southern edge of Taiwan, forming basically a U that encapsulates about 85 to 90% of the entirety of the South China Sea. Now, China has been, I think by design, ambiguous as a matter of official policy as to what that 9-dash line actually signifies in terms of a specific claim. There are different interpretations out there, and I can just offer my best assessment of what I think China means. But China itself has not stated this as a matter of official policy. And there's a kind of policy of what might be referred to as strategic ambiguity with respect to this line. But it could mean that the most expansive version that, and I'm not saying this is what it means, but it could be construed to mean, and it is often written about in U.S. media accounts to mean, that China claims the entirety, almost the entirety of the South China Sea as if it were an internal lake of the People's Republic of China. That's one interpretation. It would be like saying it's like the Great Salt Lake, wholly contained within the borders of the nation. Literally a lake. Now, if that's what China means, then there would be a very profound conflict at the doctrinal and policy levels with the United States. But what China has been very clear about
at least in off-the-record meetings, and officials have even said it, not necessarily for the record, but in meetings that we've had and many others have had, is that China, in fact, is not claiming the entirety of the South China Sea. And I'll offer one piece of very powerful evidence to support that assertion. Millions of vessels over the course of a year from other countries steam through that body of water. China doesn't do anything about it. It can't do anything about it, but it doesn't do anything about it, and it doesn't treat those vessels as if they were seeking to set sail on West Lake in Hangzhou. They don't treat South China Sea like a lake. If they wanted to try to, they could, but they don't make that effort. That's the clearest evidence of all that China doesn't view it in that expansive term. But even yesterday or the day before, I read an article in the New York Times or Washington Post that said, as one of the, paragraph 16 of the long article says, China claims the entirety of the South China Sea as its sovereign territory. That's not factually accurate, but that's the narrative that we get. And it is one interpretation that is out there because China has never painstakingly defined what it is referring to when it refers to its 9-dash claim. But that's the outer maximal limit of what China could be claiming. Probably the least restrictive or intrusive claim it could make is that within the 9 dashes that encapsulate the entirety of the South China, almost the entirety of the South China Sea, China perhaps is claiming the land features that are claimable under UNCLOS, under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, and with it, with those land features comes certain territorial and exclusive economic zone waters defined by UNCLOS. And that may be what China is actually claiming. And if so, then the majority of the water of the South China Sea would not be claimed by China. It would be high seas that anyone could navigate, etc., unless it were claimed by some other country. So one of the issues with reference to the 9-dash line is it's not clear exactly what China is claiming. And for its own reasons, China has specifically declined to specify what its claim is. That leads to reporting like the line that I just mentioned. And if you were to ask presidential candidates if China's, quote, claiming the entire South China Sea, probably most, back in the day where there were about 20 candidates running for president, 17 on the Republican side, 5 on the Democratic side at the outset, most of them would say, well, yes, that's what China's trying to do. So China is probably ill-served by not defining its claim. But my point here is that depending on how China defines its 9-dash line claim, there may be greater or lesser degree of conflict with the United States. But the punchline is this. If China is only claiming certain territories and the legitimate adjacent waters referred to as territorial waters and exclusive economic zone waters, and if China were able to negotiate that with its other 5 claimants, with the other 5 claimants to those same islands or waters, then the United States would accept the result of the peaceful negotiation of those issues, and thus it would be possible to say there's really very little conflict between that claim and the United States claim. But the problem is we don't know. So let's count the South China Sea, let's count the 9-dash line as an issue where there may be some level of real disagreement depending on how China defines its claim. Second point I would make is that there certainly is U.S. concern about Chinese land reclamation on 7 islands in the Spratlys in the southern part of the South China Sea. China has taken features that were not considered islands and turned them into islands by artificial means, by dredging up the silt from the bed of the sea and creating land where land didn't exist. And that has been a source of concern. But to put it in perspective, that action has taken place over the last several years with respect to 7 islands. And if you were to take the surface areas of those islands and even the adjacent waters and take them as a percentage of the South China Sea, it would be a small fraction of 1% of the land or water that is in question. So the U.S. disagrees with the reclamation efforts and has stated that. But the fact is it's a rather inconsequential disagreement against the backdrop of the entirety of the South China Sea. So that's an area of disagreement, but it's a rather negligible area of disagreement. The third point I would make in terms of disagreements is the Permanent Court of Arbitration. I mentioned this earlier. On July 12th, the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued a ruling, or what is called an award, meaning a decision or ruling, in a case that the Philippines brought against China in 2013, challenging China's 9-dash line claim, challenging the validity of the claim on a legal basis, challenging China's actions in the Scarborough Shoal, which is an area where China has essentially coerced the Philippines out of its earlier position of control. And on July 12th of this year, this summer, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled in favor of the Philippines and against China in every material respect in the case, basically handing China, at least symbolically speaking, a very significant and substantial defeat in a, quote, court. Now, the PCA, or the Permanent Court of Arbitration, has no ability to bind those who were involved in the case to any outcome, but it is considered an official, technically binding outcome, but there's no enforcement capability. On the matter of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's judgment, the United States and China disagree. There is a disagreement there. China rejects the entire process, rejects the validity of the process, rejects the opinion, rejects the Permanent Court of Arbitration's right or jurisdiction to ever become involved in the case, and therefore considers the entire thing null and void. The United States, for its part, has said on the record that we, the U.S., call upon China and all other parties to accept the results of the Permanent Court of Arbitration award and to move forward on that basis. So there is a difference there. However, the difference is academic, because even before the ruling was made known, it was already understood China would never adhere to it. And because there's no enforcement mechanism, China doesn't have to adhere to it in the sense of being forced to comply. And thus, in a sense, it's an academic issue, but there is disagreement. A couple of other things. The U.S. does have a concern about evident Chinese tendency toward trying to intimidate neighbors through the threat or implicit threat of military force, and also this tendency toward militarization of the South China Sea. So there is a disagreement about that. And China, for its part, has a strong disagreement with U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which means U.S. naval vessels going into the South China Sea and going within 12 nautical miles of land features, which is to say into the so-called territorial waters of certain land features, which is like going into another country. You're entering the country when you do that. And we do it. We do it because the United States wants to make the point that we do not recognize China's sovereignty over these islands. And in a sense, the United States challenges China by sending naval vessels into close waters off the shores of these land features. And China is not in a position to do anything about it, but they have strenuous objections to that. So the overall summary that I would make here, before briefly just referencing the last couple of parts of the talk, which is the assumptions and perceptions, and I'll be briefer there. The overall point that I would make is that it should be clear that there are some differences between the United States and China on the South China Sea, but they're actually much less pronounced and fundamental than they are generally portrayed to be. And if you actually say, if you were to, and one day I'll do it, I haven't had a chance yet because this is very much a work in progress, but if you actually were to put on a map and use some kind of coloration to indicate where the actual disagreements are in visual terms on the map. And if you grant that the 9-dash line claim is not the maximal claim, and I think China contends that that is not its claim, if you grant that, then what you would see on a map of the South China Sea are a few specks of color indicating where the real rubber meets the road in terms of disagreement is. But the vast majority of the sea would be clear of those indicators because there's actually very little disagreement. And that's, I think, a very important point to keep in mind. If you portray it visually, it's some disagreement, but not night and day, war and peace difference. Now, with that being said, let me make a few comments about strategic assumptions. This is really, as yet, an underexplored area in the issue of the South China Sea. A lot of people talk about the policies. A lot of people talk about what happened last night in terms of ships sailing through, or naval vessels, or freedom of navigation operations, or airplanes that may have come very close to each other from competing air forces within the airspace of the South China Sea, and so forth and so on. There's very little deep, serious discussion or exploration of the underlying strategic thinking that informs how policymakers and how leaderships actually look at the issue of the South China Sea. It's been a bit of a blind spot, I would argue, in the study of the South China Sea issue. But my contention is, if you don't understand the assumptions that leaderships are making about itself and about the other side, about their own country and about the other country, the US and China, or China and the US respectively, then you can't really place into context or make meaning of the specific policies or specific actions on the surface of the sea that may have occurred yesterday or 3 days ago. So I think it's worth delving into the strategic assumptions area to air out and catalog some of the areas where there may be disagreement between the United States and China, and to explore the impact that those potentially diverging assumptions have on the strategic thinking and the specific actions taken by the two governments. Now, there are a number of things that one could talk about in this context. And I call this kind of getting under the hood of the South China Sea issue, because it's looking at the deeper sourcing of the problem rather than just the surface examples that we see, or the superficial manifestations of tension that we see. But let me give you 4 examples of questions that I think have not been asked and not been answered. And I'm not going to seek to answer them in this discussion. But what I want to signal is that I and our EastWest Institute China Affairs team are beginning to look at these issues and bring US figures and Chinese figures and others together to talk about these kind of topics, to get a deeper understanding of these types of things. And so this is the kind of issue that I think should be explored. With that said, let me lay out 4 interesting questions that go to the assumptions of the two nations. So first of all, and I'll phrase these kind of as questions, does each country, the United States and China, actually want to resolve the South China Sea issue? Or is a solution more problematic than the problem? Now, that may sound like a very basic question, but think about it. There's kind of a reflexive tendency to assume we all want to solve this South China Sea thing, right? And who would say no to that, just in any audience? But I think there's a legitimate, real question, and I'll flesh this out with a couple of sentences here, as to whether that is so. So take it from the Chinese angle. Does China really want to solve the South China Sea question? Well, I think there's a question about that. In my mind, it's questionable. And here's why I say that. What would the two solutions to the South China Sea issue, solutions, quote unquote, or resolution of the issue entail? What would a solution entail? It would be one of two things. Either it's going to be compromise, meaning that China will give up some of what it wants in exchange for the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and yes, also Taiwan, giving up some of what they want. Right? That's one possible solution. It's called compromise, negotiation, etc. What's the other possible solution? The other possible solution is winning your claims through warfare. It's going to be one or the other, unless you just give up on your claims altogether, which I don't think anyone's planning to do. So you're either going to compromise and get 80% or 93% or 96% or 74% or some number less than 100% of what you want. Or you will get your way, the old-fashioned way, you will defeat your adversaries in war and take what you want. It will be one of those two scenarios. Now here's my question. Are either of those scenarios better for China in China's own view than the current situation? And my answer to that question is, I'm not sure that they are. In fact, I would go further and say I don't think China, and I think Chinese would agree with this particular point, I don't think China sees warfare as being good for China in a broad sense. Could it militarily defeat some of its smaller neighbors? Probably. In some cases, certainly. But what would the ultimate costs of that be? What would the role of the United States be? What would that mean for China's position in the world? There would be a huge number of second order and third order effects that China would have to think through, and I think the impact on the economy, so forth and so on, there would be a major, major cost to it. So I don't think that's an option China wants to consider. At the same time, giving up territory or water territory, if you will, maritime space, that it has already said is non-negotiable and irrevocably and permanently a part of China, is politically a very difficult thing to do as well. So maybe the best solution is to simply let this thing just stay the way it is forever. So that's an interesting question. I'm not saying that I know the definitive answer to it, and it is a subjective question about which people can disagree. But what I would say is I challenge the assumption that China for sure wants to solve this. By the way, I challenge the assumption, or at least it bears exploring, let's put it that way, that maybe the United States wants to solve this. Because right now, with the waters and various islands largely in dispute, the United States can send its naval vessels anywhere we want to, and no one can do anything about it. That's why we do it. But if every one of those 250 islands, atolls, reefs, and so on belonged to somebody, number one, we couldn't send our ships into those waters. Number two, all of a sudden, certain folks would start to have 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones, and a lot of the sea that is right now contested would belong to somebody, either in a sovereignty sense or in an economic sense. And I don't know for sure that that represents an improvement in the status quo of the United States. I don't know. But my point is that we need to go to the root of the issue and say, are the assumptions that we're operating on correct? And here, this first example is the assumption about whether people want to actually resolve this issue. Second question I would pose is, to what degree do the country's stated doctrines and policies reflect the country's actual strategic objectives? I referenced this earlier. That's why I kept using the term declared doctrine, declared policy. But let me give you an example. I think there's a lot of mistrust in both directions around the issue of strategic intentions and whether the stated policies or declared policies actually represent the true thinking of the other side. Looking at it from a Chinese perspective, they look at the so-called pivot to Asia of the United States, or more often now known as the rebalancing of the United States to Asia. And China sees containment. The U.S. doesn't characterize it that way, but that's how China sees it. And so, in the Chinese mind, there is a question as to whether the stated objectives of the U.S. rebalancing to Asia are the actual objectives of the United States. That matters because within the geographic mandate of the pivot is the South China Sea. That's why that's relevant. Looking at it a different way, China says that it wants to do things in the South China Sea, reclaim land, put installations, put a 10,000-foot landing strip, and so forth and so on, because it wants to enhance its own, China's own, ability to conduct humanitarian relief in the South China Sea, and to be able to take scientific measurements of the water and the environment and do meteorological studies and things like that. The United States, candidly, doesn't quite buy into that. We say, why do you need a 10,000-foot military-capable landing strip to do something that a 2,000-foot strip could do? There's only one use for a 10,000-foot landing strip, and it's for a heavy-duty military aircraft. So, to what degree do the stated or declared policies represent the actual strategic intentions? That is an open question. I think that goes right to the heart and soul of this issue. Is the third question, is the present status quo the optimal status quo? Is this the ideal situation or not? And some would say, well, it's neat. Of course, it's not the ideal. How could it be? We have escalating tensions. We have planes just missing each other. We have fishing boats bumping into each other. We have great disagreement. We have China seemingly militarizing certain artificial islands. We have the United States engaging in freedom of navigation operations with military vessels and so on. How could this be the best status quo that is achieved? But the question is it? Or is it not? And if it's not, what could a better status quo look like? And I'm not sure that's a question that the United States and China have really sat down and grappled with, nor is it one perhaps that the other claimants have as well. But the implications of that question are far-reaching. And fourth, just as a final example, what is the likelihood of conflagration in the South China Sea? And how might such a conflict start? And relatedly, can there be an accidental war in the South China Sea? Those are all interesting questions. For the sake of time, I won't dwell on it except to make this point. It may very well be that the United States and China have very different answers to those basic questions. All of the four questions, the four sets of questions that I just articulated. It may very well be that we don't read the situation the same way at a very basic level. And if that's the case, my argument is we need to know that, because that is probably part of the problem. And that's probably magnifying the difference or the perceived difference between the United States and China on these issues beyond what the actual facts that I described earlier in terms of real differences would have us believe. So we've got to get at the root of strategic thinking, and we have to have an honest conversation in order to really understand the true dynamics of the issue at the deep level, not just the superficial level. Now, let me just briefly touch on strategic perceptions before concluding. The perceptions is another really important piece of this issue. It's often one that is also overlooked. I referenced it earlier. Sometimes the United States and China can look at the very same set of facts but end up with absolutely different conclusions as to what those facts mean. I'll just give you one example. This is a little bit off topic, but it gets at the concept of how different the national perspectives can be. I just visited the wonderful Carter Presidential Library today. It was an extraordinarily impressive place, and I was delighted to be able to visit that presidential center and presidential library for the first time. And it got me thinking. I saw pictures of President Carter with Deng Xiaoping. I saw an interesting picture of President Carter and Richard Nixon with Deng Xiaoping, which was a really remarkable photograph that we saw. Not too many years after Nixon obviously left the White House. And think of the name and the word Nixon. What does it mean to you? And as I look at this audience, I see folks that are from the United States, and I see folks that are from China, and I see folks probably from other places. I would submit that the name Nixon to the Americans in the room has a negative connotation. I would submit that the name Nixon to the Chinese in the room has a positive connotation, because he was the person that, after all, opened up China and laid the groundwork for President Carter's normalization, etc. The same word generates two very different emotional reactions. And that's one of the dynamics that we see again and again in U.S.-China relations, and we see it with the South China Sea. So differing strategic perceptions. Let me just mention a couple of them, and I won't go into detail, but just to sort of note. There are quite a few examples where we have very different takes on the same set of facts or the same issues. Number one, the 9-dash line. I've talked about that in some detail, but let me make a different point here. China sees its claim in the South China Sea as so obvious and historically based as to be self-evident and inarguable. The United States looks at exactly the same claim and sees a claim that is so ambiguous as to be dangerous and destabilizing. The same claim, seen as crystal clear from the Chinese and self-evident and indisputable, is seen by the U.S. as ambiguous to the point of dangerous, destabilizing, and possibly leading to conflict. A very interesting difference of perception around around China's claim as a whole, in particular what we call the 9-dash line claim. Second, China believes or perceives that historical arguments in terms of sovereignty should carry the day and have greater weight than established international law today, including law to which China is a ratified signatory, namely UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. But China believes that history trumps UNCLOS, and in a sense, China regards certain claims as having been grandfathered in to legitimacy, notwithstanding the fact that those claims are incompatible with current international law to which China is a signatory. U.S. has exactly the opposite point of view, that the law, one to which we are not a ratified signatory, by the way, actually outweighs historical claims. And thus we attach greater importance to law than we do to history. China attaches greater importance to history than to law. Third point, intentions, objectives, and motivations. Who started all this, to put it simply? China perceives that the United States is really the guilty party, that it was us meddling in an area that we shouldn't be meddling in, causing problems that we shouldn't have caused, saying that we have this national interest in freedom of navigations, whipping up our quote-unquote little brothers in the Philippines and even Vietnam, Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the United States, and getting them to do things that are provocative in the Chinese view. That we're the ones, we, the United States, are the ones that kind of got all this going, and we're the ones ultimately that should take the lead in undoing the problems that we currently see in the South China Sea. The U.S. has exactly the opposite point of view, exactly the opposite perception. That China is the one that started taking these rather aggressive actions, doing things it had not done 5-10 years ago, reclaiming land, building artificial islands, militarizing to some degree one or more of these islands, and doing things that were very unconstructive and unhelpful. And the U.S. is merely reacting in a very measured way, but it's China, not the U.S., that kind of got all this going. Good example of very, very different perceptions of essentially the same sets of facts. on the issue of the role of the Philippines and Vietnam, China tends to view the Philippines and Vietnam as aggressors, as the ones that started all of this with the support of the United States, that first took control of various islands. They were the first ones to build airstrips, which, by the way, it is true that they built airstrips before China did. And they were the ones that, with the backing of the United States, are causing problems. And as you sometimes see in Chinese commentary, they are the tails wagging the dog of the United States. Yeah. And meanwhile, the United States looks at at the same two nations, Vietnam and Philippines, and says, these are small countries that are being bullied by a much larger neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. So bottom line, a lot of different areas where there are some very fundamental misperceptions, or not misperceptions, but diverging perceptions, and that too is a piece of the puzzle. So in conclusion, let me just say, there is some real disagreement between the United States and China on the South China Sea, but I think it's generally overstated and over-dramatized relative to the actual facts on the ground and on the water. Mistrust is a very substantial element of the problem in the South China Sea, and I think will continue to be as long as there isn't an honest conversation about the assumptions and about the perceptions and also the fundamental policies and doctrines of the two countries. This issue will remain with us for a long time to come. In the sense of the merits of the sovereignty claims, this is going to be an intractable issue for quite a long time. But it can be managed better or worse, more or less effectively. And that's where I think that looking at some of these issues that have been underexplored can make a difference. I don't think the United States and China are going to fight a war over the South China Sea. But I think that the South China Sea, if left unaddressed in the way that, in a sense, it has been in recent years, can continue to be and will continue to be, unfortunately, a trust drainer in the U.S.-China relationship. And what we're hoping to do at the EastWest Institute is to work on the issue, bring people together, and in an even-handed way, see if there is a way to generate better management of the issue and a better status quo for all the players involved. With that, let me thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I really look forward to